The marble floors of the Wellington County Courthouse echoed with the sharp clicks of expensive shoes as reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers filled the grand hallway. Outside, news vans lined the street like modern-day carriages, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray October sky. The case that had captivated the nation for months was finally reaching its climax. Alexander Montgomery stood in the defendant's lounge, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his navy silk tie for the 100th time that morning. At 32, he possessed the kind of classical good looks that had graced magazine covers and charity galas throughout his adult life. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his green eyes held an intelligence that had served him well in boardrooms across 3 continents. But today, those same eyes betrayed a vulnerability that no amount of wealth or privilege could mask. The results came in this morning. His lawyer, Margaret Chun, said quietly as she entered the room. Her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of practiced composure that came from decades of delivering life-changing news to clients. She carried a manila envelope that seemed to weigh more than it should, its contents holding the power to reshape everything Alexander thought he knew about himself. Margaret had been the Montgomery family lawyer for over 20 years. She had handled everything from corporate mergers to family disputes, but nothing had prepared her for this case. The woman sitting across from her had built an empire on the foundation of family legacy, and now that very foundation was crumbling beneath their feet. And Alexander's voice was barely above a whisper. He had spent the last 3 months dreading this moment while simultaneously longing for it. The uncertainty had been eating away at him like acid, corroding his sleep, his appetite, his ability to focus on anything else. Margaret opened the envelope with surgical precision, her movements deliberate and careful. Inside were several pages of technical jargon and scientific terminology, but the conclusion was written in plain English that even a child could understand. She looked up at Alexander, her dark eyes filled with something that might have been sympathy. "Alexander," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "the DNA test confirms what Rebecca Williams has been claiming. You are not Charles Montgomery's biological son." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Alexander felt the world tilt on its axis, as if gravity itself had decided to abandon him. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the wood grain blurring as his vision became unfocused. "That's impossible," he managed to say, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. Deep down, some part of him had always suspected. The way his father had looked at him sometimes, with an expression that seemed to hover between love and confusion. The way certain family traits had skipped him entirely. The way his mother, Victoria, had always been just a little too protective, a little too quick to change the subject when family resemblances were discussed. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "I know this is devastating news, Alexander, but we need to discuss what this means for the trial. Rebecca Williams is claiming that she has documentation proving your father knew about your true parentage. If that's accurate, it could completely change the inheritance case." Alexander's mind raced back to the events that had led to this moment. Rebecca Williams had appeared in their lives 6 months ago like a ghost from the past, claiming to be his father's former secretary and lover. At first, the family had dismissed her as another opportunist trying to get a piece of the Montgomery fortune. Charles Montgomery had been dead for 2 years, and vultures had been circling ever since, each with their own sob story and their own claim to a piece of his billions. But Rebecca was different. She had documents, photographs, letters written in Charles's distinctive handwriting. Most damaging of all, she had a story that explained too many of the inconsistencies in Alexander's life. She claimed that Victoria Montgomery had been having an affair with Dr. Jonathan Pierce, a family friend and prominent surgeon, and that Alexander was the product of that relationship. "My entire life has been built on a lie," Alexander said, his voice gaining strength as anger began to replace shock. "Do you understand what this means? Every business deal I've made, every relationship I've built, every decision the board has trusted me with has been based on the assumption that I'm Charles Montgomery's heir." Margaret nodded gravely. "The Montgomery Industries Board will need to be notified immediately. According to your father's will, The inheritance was specifically left to his biological heirs. If you're not his biological son, your claim to the company could be in jeopardy. The implications began cascading through Alexander's mind like dominoes falling in elaborate patterns. Montgomery Industries was worth $12 billion. It employed over 50,000 people across 4 continents. The company manufactured everything from medical devices to aerospace components, and its influence extended into politics, healthcare, and technology. Alexander had been groomed since childhood to take over the empire, attending the best schools, earning degrees from Harvard and Oxford, spending summers working in every department of the company. "What about my mother?" Alexander asked suddenly. "Does she know about the DNA results?" Margaret's expression grew even more guarded. "Victoria has been asking for updates, but I haven't shared the results with anyone except you. However, Alexander, there's something else you need to know. Rebecca Williams isn't just claiming that you're not Charles's son. She's also claiming that Victoria knew the truth all along, and that she has evidence to prove it." Alexander felt his world continuing to crumble. His relationship with his mother had always been complicated. Victoria Montgomery was a formidable woman who had married into the Montgomery family at 19 and had spent the next 40 years building herself into one of the most powerful socialites on the East Coast. She sat on the boards of a dozen charities, had politicians and celebrities on speed dial, and could end careers with a well-placed word at the right dinner party. But she had also been fiercely protective of Alexander in ways that now seemed suspicious in retrospect. She had always been quick to shut down any conversation about his childhood, had destroyed most of his baby photos during a renovation, and had been strangely adamant that he pursue careers that kept him close to home rather than accepting opportunities that would have taken him away from the family sphere of influence. "What kind of evidence?" Alexander asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Margaret hesitated before responding. "Letters, apparently. Communications between Victoria and Dr. Pierce that discuss your paternity. Rebecca claims to have intercepted them when she was working as Charles's secretary. If they're authentic, they could prove that not only did Victoria know you weren't Charles's son, but that she actively participated in covering up the truth." Alexander stood up abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse steps. Below, he could see the crowd of reporters and protesters that had been growing larger each day. Some held signs supporting him, others demanded justice for Rebecca Williams. The media had turned the case into a soap opera, complete with speculation about family secrets, corporate conspiracies, and romantic betrayals. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "Dr. Pierce is still alive. He's 81 years old and living in a retirement community in Florida. Rebecca's legal team has been trying to contact him for weeks, but, so far, he's refused to speak with anyone about the case." Alexander turned back from the window. "Do you think he knows?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that there are a lot of people who know more than they've been saying. The question is whether we can convince them to tell the truth before this case destroys everything your family has built." The door to the lounge opened, and a court clerk appeared. "Miss Chun, Judge Harrison would like to see both legal teams in his chambers before the session begins." Margaret gathered her papers and stood up. "Alexander, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens in that courtroom today, whatever revelations come to light, you're still the same person you were yesterday. Your accomplishments, your character, your worth as a human being, none of that changes because of what's written on a piece of paper." Alexander appreciated her words, but they felt hollow in the face of everything he was losing. His identity, his inheritance, his future, everything was being stripped away by scientific facts and legal documents. He had spent his entire life believing he was the heir to a dynasty, only to discover that he was actually the living embodiment of his mother's betrayal. As they walked toward the courtroom, Alexander caught sight of himself in a mirror hanging in the hallway. For the first time in his life, he looked at his reflection not as Charles Montgomery's son, but as a stranger whose real identity was still a mystery. The man looking back at him seemed different somehow, as if the DNA results had literally changed his molecular structure. The courtroom was packed to capacity when they entered. Alexander took his seat at the defendant's table, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. In the gallery, he could see his mother sitting in the front row, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression unreadable. Victoria Montgomery had faced down corporate raiders, hostile takeovers, and scandal-hungry reporters, but Alexander had never seen her look quite so fragile. Rebecca Williams sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, occasionally glancing back at Alexander with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. She was in her late 50s, with graying brown hair and the kind of understated elegance that suggested she had once moved in elevated social circles. Her claim was simple. She had been Charles Montgomery's mistress for over a decade, and she had documentation proving that he had promised to provide for her financially after his death. But her case had taken an unexpected turn when she revealed her knowledge about Alexander's true parentage. What had started as a straightforward inheritance dispute had become a public examination of one of America's most prominent families. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, and everyone rose to their feet. The judge was a distinguished man in his 60s who had presided over some of the most high-profile cases in the state's history. He had a reputation for fairness, but also for his intolerance of theatrics and media circuses. Before we begin today's proceedings, Judge Harrison announced, "I want to address the elephant in the room. I understand that certain DNA test results have been completed and that they may have bearing on this case. Ms. Chun, do you wish to present these results as evidence?" Margaret stood up slowly. "Your Honor, we would like to request a brief recess to discuss the implications of these results with our client." Motion denied, the judge said firmly. "This case has been delayed enough by various motions and procedural requests. If you have evidence that's relevant to the inheritance claim, you need to present it now." Alexander felt his heart pounding in his chest as Margaret looked back at him for confirmation. He nodded slightly, knowing that there was no point in delaying the inevitable. The truth was going to come out one way or another, and he preferred to control how it happened rather than have it forced upon him. "Your Honor," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "The DNA test results confirm that Alexander Montgomery is not the biological son of Charles Montgomery." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. In the gallery, Alexander could see his mother's face go pale, her carefully controlled composure finally cracking. Several reporters were already typing furiously on their phones, no doubt sending breaking news alerts to newsrooms across the country. Rebecca Williams closed her eyes for a moment, as if she had been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. Her lawyer, David Murphy, shuffled through his papers with renewed energy, clearly recognizing that the entire dynamic of the case had just shifted in their favor. "This changes everything," Murphy announced once order had been restored. "Your Honor, our client has maintained from the beginning that she has evidence of extensive deception within the Montgomery family. The DNA results prove that at least part of her claims are accurate." Judge Harrison looked at Margaret with a mixture of sympathy and irritation. "Ms. Chun, I assume you'll need time to reconsider your client's position in light of these results?" "Your Honor, while these results are certainly unexpected, they don't necessarily invalidate my client's claim to the Montgomery inheritance. The will specifically mentions provisions for non-biological heirs who were raised as family members." Alexander barely heard the legal arguments that followed. His mind was reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, his entire life had been dissected in front of a room full of strangers. The secret that his family had apparently been keeping for over 30 years was now public knowledge, fodder for tabloid headlines and social media speculation. He thought about all the business associates who would now question every decision he had ever made. The board members who would wonder if they could trust someone whose entire identity had been built on a lie. The competitors who would see this as an opportunity to challenge Montgomery Industries' leadership and stability. But more than anything, he thought about his relationship with his mother. Had she really known the truth all along? Had she looked at him every day for 32 years, knowing that he was living a lie? Had she participated in deceiving not just him, but his father as well? As the morning session continued, more details emerged about Rebecca's claims. She presented copies of letters, financial documents, and photographs that painted a picture of a long-term affair with Charles Montgomery. But more damaging were the hints she dropped about other family secrets, suggesting that Alexander's paternity was just the tip of an iceberg that could sink the entire Montgomery legacy. During a brief recess, Alexander found himself alone with his mother for the first time since the DNA results had been announced. Victoria approached him in the courthouse hallway, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Alexander," she began, reaching out to touch his arm. "I need you to know that everything I've ever done has been to protect you." He pulled away from her touch, suddenly, unable to bear the physical contact. "Protect me from what?" "The truth." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, something Alexander had seen maybe 3 times in his entire life. "You don't understand how complicated it was. Your father Charles was a good man, but he was also ruthless. If he had known about you, about Jonathan, it would have destroyed all of us. So you decided to build my entire life on a lie instead?" Alexander's voice was rising, attracting attention from other people in the hallway. "Do you have any idea what this means for me? For the company? For everything we've worked for?" "I know you're angry," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "But please don't let that anger cloud your judgment. There are things about this family, about your father, that you still don't know. Rebecca Williams isn't the innocent victim she's pretending to be." Before Alexander could respond, Margaret appeared at his elbow. "We need to get back inside. Judge Harrison wants to hear Rebecca's testimony about the alleged correspondence between you and Dr. Pierce." As they walked back into the courtroom, Alexander realized that his life had become a public spectacle, a cautionary tale about the dangers of family secrets and the price of deception. He was no longer just Alexander Montgomery, heir to a business empire. He was now Alexander Montgomery, the man whose entire identity had been revealed as a fraud in front of a room full of strangers. The afternoon session would bring even more revelations, as Rebecca Williams took the stand to detail everything she claimed to know about the Montgomery family's hidden history. Alexander braced himself for more bombshells, knowing that each new piece of information would strip away another layer of the life he thought he had understood. But even as his world crumbled around him, Alexander began to feel something unexpected: relief. For the first time in his life, the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right about his place in the Montgomery family finally made sense. The DNA results hadn't just destroyed his identity. They had also validated a suspicion that had been lurking in the back of his mind for years. As Rebecca Williams was sworn in and took her place on the witness stand, Alexander prepared himself for the next chapter of revelations that would reshape everything he thought he knew about his family, his future, and himself. Rebecca Williams adjusted the microphone in front of her and looked directly at Alexander as she prepared to testify. There was something in her expression that seemed almost apologetic, as if she regretted being the messenger who had to destroy his life. Her voice was steady when she began to speak, but Alexander could detect an underlying tremor that suggested this testimony was as difficult for her as it was devastating for him. "I worked as Charles Montgomery's personal secretary for 12 years, Rebecca began, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "From 1987 to 1999. During that time, I handled his private correspondence, managed his personal appointments, and was privy to information that very few people ever knew about." David Murphy, Rebecca's attorney, approached the witness stand with a folder full of documents. "Ms. Williams, can you tell the court about the nature of your relationship with Charles Montgomery?" Rebecca's composure faltered slightly, and she glanced toward Victoria in the gallery before answering. "Charles and I became romantically involved in 1989, approximately 2 years after I started working for him. It wasn't something either of us planned, but it developed into a relationship that lasted for over a decade." The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the scratch of pens as reporters took notes. Alexander watched his mother's face carefully, looking for any sign of surprise or shock, but Victoria's expression remained carefully neutral. He wondered if she had known about Rebecca all along, or if this was another revelation that was catching her off guard. "During your relationship with Mr. Montgomery," Murphy continued, "did you ever have access to personal family information?" "Yes," Rebecca replied. "Charles trusted me with many private matters. He would often ask me to handle sensitive correspondence, arrange private meetings, and manage situations that required discretion." Murphy handed her a manila folder. "I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit A. Can you identify these documents? Rebecca opened the folder and examined the papers inside. These are copies of letters exchanged between Victoria Montgomery and Dr. Jonathan Pierce between 1991 and 1992. I made copies of them when they came through Charles's office. Alexander felt his stomach drop. The timeline matched perfectly with what he now knew about his own birth. He had been born in December 1991, which meant these letters would have been written around the time of his conception and birth. Can you tell the court how these letters came to be in Mr. Montgomery's possession? Murphy asked. Rebecca took a deep breath before answering. Charles had hired a private investigator to look into Victoria's activities. He suspected she was having an affair, but he needed proof before he could take any action. The investigator intercepted these letters and brought them to Charles through me. Victoria's composure finally cracked, and Alexander could see her hands shaking as she gripped her purse. The revelation that Charles had known about the affair added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Did you read the contents of these letters? Murphy continued. Yes, Rebecca said quietly. Charles asked me to summarize their contents for him. They detailed Victoria's affair with Dr. Pierce and discussed concerns about the paternity of her unborn child. Alexander felt as if he had been physically struck. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, painting a picture of a family built on deception and secrets. But what troubled him most was the implication that his father Charles had known the truth and had chosen to keep it hidden. Margaret stood up for her cross-examination, her expression carefully controlled but determined. Ms. Williams, you claim to have been Mr. Montgomery's secretary and lover for over a decade. If that's true, why did your relationship end in 1999? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Charles ended our relationship when he decided to focus on his family. He felt guilty about the affair and wanted to try to rebuild his marriage with Victoria. And during this 12-year relationship, Margaret continued, did Mr. Montgomery ever promise to include you in his will or provide for you financially after his death? He made verbal commitments to take care of me, Rebecca replied. But he said it would be complicated because of the family situation. Margaret approached the witness stand with her own folder of documents. I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit B. This is a copy of Charles Montgomery's personal bank records from 1995 to 2005. Can you show the court any evidence of financial support provided to you during this time? Rebecca examined the documents, her confidence wavering for the first time. Charles was very careful about how he handled our relationship financially. He often gave me cash gifts or paid for things indirectly. Cash gifts, Margaret repeated. So there's no paper trail documenting this alleged decade-long financial support? Not in the traditional sense, Rebecca admitted. Alexander watched this exchange with growing confusion. If Rebecca had truly been his father's mistress for so long, it seemed odd that there would be no financial record of their relationship. Charles Montgomery had been meticulous about his business records. It was hard to believe he would have been so careless about documenting a relationship that had apparently been central to his personal life. Margaret continued her cross-examination, focusing on the timeline of Rebecca's claims. Ms. Williams, you stated that you left Mr. Montgomery's employ in 1999. Can you tell the court what you've been doing for the past 24 years? I worked for several other executives in administrative roles, Rebecca replied. I also spent time caring for my elderly mother until she passed away in 2018. And during all those years, Margaret pressed, did you ever attempt to contact Mr. Montgomery about his alleged promises to provide for you? Rebecca hesitated before answering. I respected his decision to focus on his family. I didn't want to cause problems for him. So you waited until after his death to make these claims? I waited until I had no other choice, Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger. I'm not a wealthy woman, Ms. Chun. I've spent my savings caring for my mother and dealing with my own health issues. I only came forward when I realized that the Montgomery family was trying to rewrite history and pretend that their perfect image had never been tainted by scandal. Alexander found himself wondering about Rebecca's motivations. Was she truly seeking justice for a wrong done to her years ago, or was she simply an opportunist taking advantage of a wealthy family's vulnerabilities? The answer seemed to matter less now that the DNA results had confirmed at least part of her story. During the lunch recess, Alexander found himself alone with Margaret in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse. His untouched sandwich sat on the table between them as he struggled to process everything that had been revealed during the morning session. "What do you think?" Alexander asked. "Is she telling the truth about the relationship with my father?" Margaret considered the question carefully before responding. "Parts of her story are clearly accurate. The DNA results prove that she was right about your paternity. But I'm concerned about some of the other details. The lack of financial records, the convenient timing of her claims, the fact that she waited so long to come forward. There are elements that don't quite add up." "But what about those letters she mentioned? The ones between my mother and Dr. Pierce?" "That's what worries me most," Margaret admitted. "If those letters are authentic, they could be devastating. They would prove not only that Victoria knew about your true parentage, but that she actively participated in deceiving Charles." Alexander pushed his sandwich away, his appetite completely gone. "I need to talk to Dr. Pierce. If he's really my biological father, don't I have a right to know the truth directly from him?" Margaret nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. But we need to be careful about how we approach him. If Rebecca's legal team gets to him first, they could influence his testimony in ways that might not be favorable to your case." "What case?" Alexander asked bitterly. "My entire claim to the Montgomery inheritance is based on being Charles's son. Now that we know that's not true, what exactly am I fighting for?" "There are still provisions in the will for non-biological heirs," Margaret reminded him. "Charles loved you and raised you as his son. That relationship has legal significance, regardless of biological parentage." But Alexander wasn't convinced. He had spent his entire adult life making business decisions based on his position as the Montgomery heir. Board members had trusted him, investors had followed his lead, and competitors had respected his authority, all because they believed he represented the continuation of Charles Montgomery's legacy. Now that foundation had been removed, and he wasn't sure what would be left. The afternoon session brought more testimony from Rebecca, this time focusing on the specific content of the letters she claimed to have intercepted. As she read excerpts aloud, Alexander felt his understanding of his family's history continue to crumble. In one letter dated September 1991, Rebecca testified. Victoria wrote to Dr. Pierce expressing concern about what would happen if Charles discovered the truth about her pregnancy. She wrote, and I quote, "Jonathan, I'm terrified that Charles will figure out the timing. If he realizes this baby could be yours, it will destroy everything we've worked so hard to build." Alexander glanced at his mother, who had gone completely pale. The specificity of the quote suggested that Rebecca either had access to the actual letters or had an incredibly detailed memory of their contents. In Dr. Pierce's response, Rebecca continued, he wrote, "Victoria, we have to trust that Charles loves you enough not to ask the questions we're afraid he might ask. But if the worst happens, I want you to know that I will never abandon you or the baby." The courtroom was completely silent as the implications of these letters sank in. If they were authentic, they proved not only that Victoria and Dr. Pierce had been having an affair, but that they had both suspected Alexander might not be Charles's biological son. David Murphy approached the witness stand with more documents. "Ms. Williams, did you ever witness any conversations between Charles Montgomery and his wife about these letters?" "Yes," Rebecca replied. "In December 1991, about 2 weeks after Alexander was born, Charles called Victoria into his office. I was asked to wait outside, but I could hear raised voices through the door." "Could you make out any specific words or phrases?" Rebecca nodded. "I heard Charles say something about the truth about the baby, and Victoria responding that timing doesn't prove anything." When Victoria left the office, she was crying. Alexander felt as if he was watching his family's history being dissected like a specimen under a microscope. Every private moment, every secret conversation was being exposed and analyzed for a room full of strangers. But the most disturbing aspect of Rebecca's testimony was the implication that Charles had known about the affair and Alexander's questionable paternity from the very beginning. If that was true, then Alexander's entire childhood had been performed against a backdrop of lies and pretense that he had been completely unaware of. Margaret's afternoon cross-examination focused on challenging the authenticity of the letters Rebecca claimed to have copied. Ms. Williams, Margaret began. You claim to have made copies of private correspondence between Victoria Montgomery and Dr. Pierce over 30 years ago. Do you still have the original copies you made? I kept copies of the most important documents, Rebecca replied. But some were lost over the years due to various moves and personal circumstances. So the court is being asked to take your word about the content and authenticity of documents that may or may not still exist. I have several of the original copies, Rebecca said defensively. And I remember the content of the others very clearly because of how shocking they were. Margaret produced her own set of documents. I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit C. This is a handwriting analysis of the letters you've provided, conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a certified forensic document examiner. Dr. Mitchell has concluded that while the handwriting appears to be consistent with samples of Victoria Montgomery's writing, there are several anachronisms in the paper and ink that suggest these documents may have been created much more recently than you claim. Alexander watched Rebecca's composure crack for the first time since she had begun testifying. The possibility that some of the letters might be forgeries added another layer of complexity to an already bewildering case. Dr. Mitchell's analysis also indicates, Margaret continued, that some of the phraseology and terminology used in these letters is more consistent with contemporary language patterns than with correspondence from the early 1990s. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I may have made some errors when I recreated some of the letters from memory, but the essential content is accurate. So you're admitting that you recreated some of these letters rather than providing actual copies? Only a few of them, Rebecca said, her voice growing defensive. The majority are authentic copies of the original correspondence. Alexander realized that the case was becoming even more complicated than he had imagined. While the DNA results were indisputable scientific fact, the documentary evidence that Rebecca was providing might be a mixture of truth and fabrication. The challenge would be determining which elements of her story were accurate and which might be embellishments designed to strengthen her legal position. As the afternoon session concluded, Judge Harrison announced that the court would reconvene the following morning to hear testimony from additional witnesses. Alexander knew that meant Dr. Pierce might finally be compelled to testify, a prospect that both terrified and intrigued him. Walking out of the courthouse, Alexander was surrounded by reporters shouting questions about his reaction to the DNA results and his plans for the Montgomery Industries leadership. He pushed through the crowd without comment, but he could feel the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing down on him. His driver was waiting at the curb, and Alexander slumped into the back seat of the black sedan as they pulled away from the courthouse. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't know where he belonged or what role he was supposed to play. The identity that had defined him for 32 years had been stripped away in a single morning, leaving him feeling like a stranger in his own life. As they drove through the city, Alexander's phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, business associates, and reporters. Each ring reminded him that the consequences of the day's revelations would extend far beyond his personal identity crisis. Montgomery Industries employed thousands of people who depended on stable leadership, and the uncertainty surrounding Alexander's legitimacy could have ripple effects throughout the entire organization. But perhaps most troubling was the realization that his relationship with his mother might never recover from the deceptions that were being exposed. Victoria had been the one constant in his life, the person he had trusted above all others. The possibility that she had been lying to him for his entire existence felt like a betrayal that went deeper than any legal or financial consequences. As the sedan pulled up to his penthouse apartment, Alexander realized that tomorrow would bring even more revelations that could further reshape his understanding of his family and himself. Dr. Jonathan Pierce held the key to many of the remaining questions about his parentage and his parents' relationship. Whatever the elderly surgeon had to say would either validate Rebecca's claims or expose them as elaborate fabrications. But regardless of what new truths emerged, Alexander knew that his life had been permanently altered by the events of this day. The man who had woken up that morning as the heir to a business empire was going to sleep as someone whose very identity was in question. Tomorrow would determine whether there was anything left of his old life worth salvaging, or whether he would need to build an entirely new identity from the ruins of everything he had once believed about himself. Alexander woke before dawn on the second day of testimony, his mind immediately flooded with the surreal events of the previous day. The DNA results felt like something that had happened to someone else, a nightmare that he would eventually wake up from and laugh about over breakfast. But, as he sat on the edge of his bed, looking out at the city lights that were beginning to fade into the gray morning sky, the reality of his situation settled over him like a weight he couldn't escape. His phone had been buzzing all night with messages from reporters, business associates, and family friends. Most wanted statements about his plans for Montgomery Industries, but others were clearly fishing for more personal details about his reaction to learning he wasn't Charles Montgomery's biological son. He had turned off the phone around midnight, but he knew that the outside world would be waiting for him regardless of his readiness to face it. A soft knock on his bedroom door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Alexander?" came the voice of Elena, his housekeeper. "There's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Alexander pulled on a robe and walked to the front door of his penthouse, wondering who would be visiting at such an early hour. Through the peephole, he was shocked to see his mother standing in the hallway, looking more disheveled than he had ever seen her. Victoria's usually perfect silver hair was slightly mussed, her makeup was minimal, and she was wearing a simple black coat instead of her usual designer ensembles. "Mom," Alexander said as he opened the door, "what are you doing here?" Victoria stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk before court today. There are things you need to understand before Dr. Pierce testifies." Alexander gestured toward his living room, but Victoria remained standing near the door, as if she wasn't sure whether she would be welcome to sit down. The distance between them felt enormous, even though they were only a few feet apart. "I know you're angry with me," Victoria began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "And you have every right to be. But before you hear Dr. Pierce's version of events, I need you to know what really happened." Alexander crossed his arms and waited for her to continue. Part of him wanted to comfort his mother, who looked more fragile than he had ever seen her. But a larger part of him was still reeling from the betrayal of learning that his entire life had been built on deceptions she had helped create. "Your father Charles knew," Victoria said quietly. "From the very beginning, he knew you might not be his biological son, but he chose to raise you anyway because he loved you." Alexander felt his anger flare. "You're telling me that for 32 years, everyone knew except me? That I've been living a lie while the rest of you just played along?" "It wasn't like that," Victoria said, finally moving to sit.